this book, The Beholder. My writing life has been a series of obsessions, or a response to obsessions, to needs. In the late 60s, I had a great need to try to take stock of the 60s, and that's where I began as a writer. In the 70s, I had the hunger to try to take stock of what was going on between men and women, and I wrote my first book of stories about love, men and women in and out of love. That was Who Wrote the Book of Love. By the 90s, my obsession had become War Motion, the Pacific, trying to find a way to talk about that great natural force. With this book, The Beholder, my obsession began with the female nude. I had planned a nonfiction book on the female nude, responding to certain famous paintings and photographs. And I wanted to respond to the art history and feminist discourse about these works of art. And I also wanted to write about my own experience as a writer working with figure models, describing them in words. But instead, what emerged was this novel, this story. For me, this is a story about art, both about certain works of art and about the redemptive possibilities of art. It's also, for me, a story about love, about death, and about sexual passion. I want to say that, oddly enough perhaps, in all my previous work, the act of sexual love is something that's taken as a given. It always happens off stage, something that just happened or is going to happen. It's never explicitly described. Maybe there's a reference to a man looking at the curve of his wife's breast. That's about as risque as I got. Now, why I did that, I don't know. But that was how I approached that subject in my fiction for years, and in my nonfiction. But as you'll see when you read this book, this novel is different. Herman Melville said, writing to Hawthorne after he finished Moby Dick, he wrote, "I have written a wicked book and feel spotless as the lamb." Here's a verse from John Donne's poem, The Ecstasy, which is the epigraph for this book. "To our bodies turn we then, that so weak men on love revealed may look. Love's mysteries in souls do grow, but yet the body is his book." So I'm going to read this evening from the opening section of the novel called Representations, and in it I try to lay out all the cards that are going to be picked up later in the book. I'll be both reading some sections and excerpting, and you'll be able to tell the difference. I'll fill in for you when I'm making jumps. Don't be scared. I'll just read for about 20-25 minutes. The novel, for me, is a fairy tale, and it begins, as fairy tales do, once upon a time. There are two protagonists. One is a male. He's 49. He's a writer. And the other is a young woman who's just finished her PhD as an art historian, but she also wants to write fiction. Her aunt, who's kind of her parent figure, knows the writer as a friend of friends, and she calls the writer, and she wants him to meet her niece, to talk to her about writing fiction. Can he meet with the niece? To read a manuscript, pass on names of editors or agents, or occasionally to mentor, it's part of a writer's life. So coffee with, as it turns out, a lovely young woman, who then invites him to a party she and her husband are giving. Saying he regrets he can't make it, the writer suggests lunch. They talk novels, movies, painters. She's finishing Shama on Rembrandt. He recites a Larkin poem. She's brought some Rilke. He gives her one of his own books, says she can keep it if she likes. She recounts the stormy life of Caravaggio. Thus they meet twice, and she's married, has what seems to him a loud diamond ring. Perhaps he decides because her charm and wit are so flirtatious. High heels, makeup, large blue eyes, lips very red. Dressy for academia, theatrical. The writer likes seeing her. Hard-working, ambitious, self-absorbed, but why not? A perquisite of beauty? Drinking in concerts and lectures. And she says her husband spoils her. Vain. A bit of a coquette. The word's just about archaic, he thinks. Also, she has an air of being young for her age, a kind of adolescent hunger for absolutes, fervor about, say, the meaning of art. Once, she asks the writer to explain why art matters. Tell you the truth, he says, I just try to do my books. Deflecting the question, he spent his adult life at his métier, of course has had to consider its qualities. I know it must sound foolish, she says, laughs at her own expense. Finding such self-deprecation winning, he wonders if this is the kind of concern he had in his early 20s. In any case, she's married but has yet to tell her aunt. Old story. Authority figure objects to the beloved. Youth ducks the battle. So, as she puts it, kind of a secret. Shared with the writer after he explains that his late mother never saw her mother again once she married. But this young woman does see her aunt, simply hasn't mentioned that her life's changed. This particular afternoon, she visits the writer's cottage for the first time. They're in the living room. The writer sits across from her on the love seat in the alcove. It's hard for him to make out some of her words because of her soft voice and slight accent. She arrived in the States at 17. Why don't you come over here, he says. The sentence sounds abrupt. The writer thinks he can hear her weigh it. All right. She gets up, crosses the room, sits beside him. Later, he suggests she check out the cottage if she likes. Where do you sleep, she asks, after looking into the 2 bedrooms. Depends who else is here, he says. Immediately, seeing her expression, he revises. Downstairs, upstairs, when I have house guests. Oh. She continues to wander. He remembers his friend Fred telling him the young have no content, are all ideas, and ruthless. She's in his cottage, examining it, examining him, a kind of collector. Not much more, though she later says all such encounters carry sexual ambiguity. Still, knowledge is what she's after. He's source material. So in the attic, years ago converted to a library, sections of books on Hawaii, ocean, surfing, Pacific Island literature, not of much interest to her. Descending the stairs to the study, she sits on a step reading titles on the facing shelves. Above the books on death and lying are shelves of books on sex and or the erotic. The Female Nude by Linda Need. Janet Hophouse's The Bride Stripped Bare. She says, as if tasting a sweet. I like these. Picks up yet another book, slips it back in place. Seeing this, he feels a sense of kinship. She's doing what he would do, has done so many times. If years before, when he was her age, you asked him to choose between the woman in front of him or her bookcases, well, he'd have contrived to take in both, would have asked for pencil and paper. Do you want pencil and paper, he says. No, thank you. Still browsing. Kinship. She's oddly like, not oneself, but oneself were he a young woman. Not a sentiment he remembers experiencing. I'd love to work my way through these shelves, she says. I treasure books, perhaps too much. She hesitates. A long time ago, someone I cared for told me, life's not a book. Too true, he replies, mulling the phrase cared for. As for the title she's been looking at, she knows he's interested in academic discourse on the female figure. That first day at coffee, he'd mentioned Balzac's unknown masterpiece, famous tale of 3 artists and a model. Subsequently, at lunch, she brought a book about the Balzac to loan him. Thus, he's not at all surprised when she asks, I just don't quite understand what you're exploring in this area. Fair question, but his answer startles him. It's related to working with figure models, he says. Figure models? He can't believe it. As with all work in progress, he's kept it to himself. So many empowering privacies. You know, he says, having them pose. In art class? No. Here, in the study. Like Rodin in his 60s. The models he kept around his atelier, the thousands of sketches. She says, I've written about Rodin in my thesis. Well, he replies, I'm younger than Rodin was. He chides himself for this, and less obsessed, I think. He pauses, trying to slow down. So how do you do it, she asks. Just what I'd want to know. I bring a chair from the living room. The model sits over there near the desk. I'm not sure where it's going. Part of being a writer is being able to wait to find out. She smiles. You said models, plural. How many, if you don't mind my asking? I don't mind. Still feeling he's made a mistake. Maybe 20 the last 2 years. I have some models returned, but no photographs, no sketching. Also, just one at a time. No photographs? No sketching? What are you doing? You know, I suppose I thought, why should only visual artists get to study the female form? But also I felt I'd never looked carefully enough at women. Too much pursuit, too much need. What had I failed to see? She nods. He'd not articulated this before, has, as usual, just launched himself into another 3 or 5 year book mania. How do you do it? She asks. They sit in the chair on a towel, a clean towel. Such generosity. Oh, come on, you asked. So, same chair, same place, constraints of form, like rhyme or meter. They take off their clothes in the bathroom, walk in here. I'm at the desk, computer on. I've already explained how it will work when they call to answer the ad. Ad? Author seeks figure model, female, and so on. Did you get many responses? 40, 50, some women called over and again. God, you're crazy. He hears the admiration, though. Yes, anyway, I tell the model we can talk or not talk. Some take a book off the shelf and read, a book I've written, perhaps. If they do talk, I try to catch a sense of how they speak. Meanwhile, I'm looking and sketching them in words on the computer. It's a lot of work, actually. I'll bet, she says. Come on. Then I make notes after they leave. 1 model a day is more than plenty. 1 a week. It's been months since the last session. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going with it. Suddenly he feels exhausted. She says, are you going to make notes after I leave? He maneuvers to gather himself. You haven't modeled, he responds, and they both laugh. Manet's painting, Olympia, first shown in Paris in 1865, provoked shock, hostility. No mythological maiden, but a young working-class woman from Paris. Invisible Renaissance nipples, no pubic hair, self-caressing hand on thigh, summoning the observer's attention. The writer studies the painting, reads conflicting critical opinions about it. Not, he thinks, that anyone can talk about Olympia without implicating himself, herself. Olympia, the model, Victorine, in her late teens, had already posed for other artists, eventually became a painter. And why Victorine for Manet? Her flair for mimicry? Because she was simply a mannequin? Whatever, Manet painted Victorine in various guises, as herself, as matador, as street singer, and without clothes. Meanwhile, Olympia's famous gaze, defiant, indifferent. During the young woman's visit to the cottage, they discussed the painting. At one point, fixing her eyes on the writer, she formed a half circle at her throat with thumb and forefinger. Olympia's ribbon. Isn't the question on most minds, she then said, very pleased with herself, whether or not Olympia's looking at a man she knows well, and if so, how well? They're leaving the cottage that day, and she says, your heroic enterprise with the models makes me think of Dürer. You know, draftsman drawing a nude. There's the artist at his work table, the paper blocked out, his bulging eyes devouring the reclining woman. It's amusing. She's on the far edge of that gridded screen, well out of reach. Her lower body is draped. There's all the technology of art and so much not happening. Are you comparing me to the draftsman? She laughs. Standing beside her at the front gate, the writer feels he's made a mistake giving up that privacy of his. As if sensing his dismay, she asks, "May I describe your project to my husband?" Reminding him, he supposes, that she's very married. "Do what you want," he replies more curtly than he intended, and compounding the error, adds, "You're a grown-up." "What do you prefer?" she says. No defensiveness. What does he prefer? Why is that important? And compared to what else that's important? She's waiting. "I prefer you tell anyone else I'm doing research on representations of the female figure in Western art." "All right, no problem." No problem. Her colloquial English is rich with a savor of irony. And, the writer realizes, she's just consented to several things at once. A week later, the writer receives a letter from her. "I've been thinking about your intriguingly transgressive project. Art historians say that nothing is more difficult to render than flesh. I especially appreciate that you don't yet know where you're going. I'd also suppose, given your writing, that you're not going to try to compete with visual artists. Leonardo da Vinci in the Paragon wrote that it would be hopeless to try to do in words what a painter does in a moment. Perhaps the simultaneous movement of so many compelling aspects, hands, lips, eyes, is just too nuanced and quicksilver for the verbal. Or perhaps you'll prove the contrary. Either way, I fear that in all the banter, I failed to make this clear. I'm very glad we met." Rereading the letter, the writer mutters, "Transgressive, quicksilver," and he sees that the return address is her aunt's home. The writer has a banker friend, just divorced, pretty lonely. "A fringe benefit of art," he tells the writer, "is that women admire artists." "Well," the writer replies, hearing the unstated, "You have it easy. If you're changing vocations, my friend, to spend so much time in one study would hardly be the shortest path to Eros. Try teaching tango." But of course the writer could argue it differently. He knows an older author still publishing who likes to insist his earlier fiction was peacock feather spreading, pure mating behavior. Now this young woman, her apparent idealization, despite teasing, of the risks she imagines the writer's taken. They meet again after about a month. Quick coffee, she's on her way to teach. She seems preoccupied, and the writer's uncomfortable. What are they doing anyway? That scene goes on, and she disappears down to the subway and is kind of gone from sight. Leafing through his notes, the writer comes across a description of the male artist in George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. Half vivisector, half vampire, using women to surprise their inmost secrets, to make him see visions and dream dreams, to inspire him, as he calls it. Which puts the writer in mind of a serial rapist who years before terrorized his neighborhood. Finally apprehended, the rapist proved to be an amateur photographer, deft at asking a stranger if he could take her picture, offering prints in return. Many women, none of them as rape victims, undressed in exchange for the art rendered. Visions, dreams, how one beholds the object of desire, and or the gaze of seducer and seduced. Who's curious? Who's subjugated? Who identifies with whom? How? To some thinkers, seeing is metamorphosis for both seer and seen, bound to the cruelties and disorders of sex. Others argue that men make a fetish of women, denying the female body meaning of its own. In his famous Confessions, Jean-Jacques Rousseau recounts how at age 30 he's in Venice. No Casanova, Rousseau's been alone in this party town, having a disgust for prostitutes, other women unavailable to him. One day he's approached by a young courtesan, a whirlwind. She pretends to mistake him for someone else, theatrically claims possession. When they next meet, Rousseau's in a state of rapture. About to have such sweet pleasure bestowed on him, however, Rousseau begins to wonder, why me? Of course, poor Rousseau cannot not work it out. He writes, I perceived that she had a malformed nipple. Now poor Rousseau held in his arms a monster, rejected by nature, men, and love. Not surprisingly, the young woman tells him, Lascia le donne e studia la matematica. Give up the ladies and study mathematics. The models. One gets to stare. So what about it? Stimulation through gazing or exposing oneself to the gaze of another is, for psychoanalysts, a twisted form of penetrating the other. In their scheme of things, there can be active and sadistic desire to gaze or passive, masochistic desire to be gazed at, from which, they argue, emerge curiosity and artistic display. The writer thinks it over. No one stands outside the conversation, he tells himself. Each story is partial, each narrator blind to or suppressing aspects of character and history. What about the exuberance of looking? What about visual feasting? The writer laughs. Gloomy, these analysts, as if they believe we're all just too much for ourselves. Deep waters indeed. But the writer is sure this is nothing from which to avert one's eyes. As for the writer's current effort to see things for what they are, so to speak, this compelling young woman commended the daybooks and photographs of Edward Weston. Now he has a new stack of titles beside his desk. Weston's female nudes, hundreds of them. Face often omitted, geometry of breast, torso, thigh, back, narrative erased. Charisse Wilson, one of Weston's wives and models, wrote that Weston took his pictures of her before making love, almost dancing with his three-legged camera, she said, carrying the model beyond exhibitionism or narcissism. In his daybooks, Edward Weston, then around 40, asked plaintively, why this tide of women? This tide of women. Large and small, older and younger, more or less beautiful to the writer, he accepts those models who most want the job. Reading that Greek friends of Edward Weston told Weston that there were three perfect shapes, hull of a boat, violin, and a woman's body, the writer is tempted to demur, to counter with, say, waves, chambered nautilus, the branching patterns of trees. Nonetheless, surfer and sailor, guitarist, and now a man staring very hard at the models, he concludes that the proposition surely bears looking into. The plot is going to thicken. And she's listening to some Lieder on her Walkman. And she asks him, are you familiar with Lieder? And he replies, oh, sure. My mother was an accomplished soprano. She had a concert career. Schubert and Schumann were part of childhood. Lyrics with all kinds of leave-takings and sorrows. How lucky you were, she says. Such ethereal songs make my heart tremble, make me long to be a better person, for a story with grand closure. The writer, not surprisingly, refrains from explaining how he resisted Lieder as an adolescent. Too much high culture, too consonant with Puritan graveyards, the relentless limits of winter. After he first saw Northern California at 20, he returned to stay, rock and roll on the car radio. No death in California, he thought. As if having decided something important, She then says, "My American friends think because I've been with just one man that I'm repressed. I have a great passion for the person I love. It's not repression, but renunciation. That's quite different." "I'm sure it is," the writer says. And feeling now that another affirmative's required, adds, "Yes." She looks at her watch. As if by mutual assent, they prepare to leave. At the door, they embrace, pull back, look at each other. "Good night," she says. "It was wonderful to see you." "Same here," he says. "See you again soon, I hope." I'm kind of waiting to see what happens next myself. So what happens next is the writer goes back to Hawaii, a place where he spends a lot of time, and he's going to try to write about a decrepit ruin, a ruined sugar mill, a 19th century mill which has been overgrown by banyan trees. And the place disturbs him. It's kind of, it gives him what they call in Hawaii chicken skin. Now, before he left for Hawaii, he described his project to this young woman. And he described the ruined mill and the banyan trees. And she asked him, "Do you know about the Bodhi tree? It's like a banyan. Buddha sat under a Bodhi tree one night, wouldn't budge till he achieved enlightenment. At dawn, beholding the morning star, Buddha cried out, 'Wonderful, wonderful, all beings are perfect, just the way they are.'" You know, the writer tells her, "I'd forgotten that story, but if you don't mind, I might use it." "I thought you might," she says. "Thank you," the writer responds, "but in any case," he says, "I'm no Buddha." "Now you tell me." "I mean, my trees are apt to speak for nostalgia and decay." "Despite all that growing?" she says. In the ruined mill, the writer's looking as hard as he can, making notes, then goes down again to see the ocean, to study waves. Later, he encounters an exuberantly garrulous plantation employee. Soon they're bouncing down cane roads in a company pickup, the man recounting endless tales about the plantation. Far more here than Kay. Another serendipity of art, and the writer feels blessed. His kind of enlightenment. At one site they stop, the employee teasing field workers about waiting for a wind shift before igniting the stalks. "Just burn the fucker," he yells. "Hey, what about the EPA?" a worker replies. "You know, clean air, that poor old lady's house over there." The workers wait. The writer waits. "Fuck the woman and her fucking house too," his companion shouts. "And fuck the EPA. You tell them, we suck, but we do not swallow." While in Hawaii, the writer sends her a draft of what he's writing about the mill and the banyan trees, and receives a letter back. She writes, "Summer is calm and dry. Every sound is fragile." She encloses a Rilke poem she's translated, underlines, "In the valley, I am a jubilant Jerusalem." "I was thinking about Rilke's love life," she writes. "His resistance to involvement is the wall that protects his jubilant Jerusalem." The last time they'd met for coffee, before his departure, she'd seemed to read the writer as a kind of Rilke. "Actually," he said, "I've lived several commitments longer than your marriage, each with many joys. Who could be comfortable with Rilke's, 'What more my wife and child than visitors I could not ask to leave'?" "You've given it some thought," she says. "Hey, listen. Take Requiem for a Friend, Rilke's response to the death of his lover Paula. Poem notwithstanding, the ways in which Rilke failed her were pretty ordinary. Or his famous line, 'You must change your life.' Well, did he? You're writing, you'll have to think it through." But she has thought it through. May believe that the poems redeem, or are part of a better person than the Rilke without them. In her letter to Hawaii, she encloses the opening of another Rilke poem. "All of you undisturbed cities, haven't you ever yearned for the enemy? And this section of the book and this reading will close with this last section. Back at home, thinking about the models, the writer comes across a line from George Bataille suggesting that the erotic image, like eroticism itself, exiles death. Bataille also saw eroticism as violation, akin to death in its shock to the heart. Later, the writer reads the observations of photographer Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who writes, "A young woman was visiting the house, and we were speaking of the problems of photographing the nude. I asked her to pose for me, and she accepted. When she returned, she was prepared for the sitting in a simple dress. At the moment she was disrobing, I asked her to pause." Manuel Bravo also says, "Death is the ultimate nude. Death removes flesh. Death removes everything. All that remains are death and the great nude, the bones." Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I'm also happy to take questions if you have any. You don't have to have any. Yes? Yes.
Do you have any, what are you looking at next?
Well, I'm tempted to do that nonfiction book that I described as the original provocation. I read all of this extraordinary discourse about these paintings, the academic discourse, also often a feminist discourse. I read carefully and tried to think through the whole discourse on pornography. And I'm very loath to give up, all my notes and not make use of them. So I may do that. But also, some of you know I'm drawn to the epigrammatic, and I have just to kind of, to cleanse my palate, I'm doing another little book of epigrams. Yes? Anyone else? Yes?
When you first started, did you try to experiment writing about a nude model?
Oh, I did, yeah.
What was it like?
Well, I felt, kind of like a 13-year-old, I suppose. I felt it was transgressive to me. And then I thought, well, actually, this is what my life is, isn't it? To have an idea and to try to see it through. No one else will do it. And isn't it, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And so here I was going to have to do this terrible thing of trying to work with the figure models. And I really did, I didn't know where it was going to go. And it is a tough job. But I thought, hell, why should visual artists have all the fun? And also, what's going on? What is it? Like, if it's transgressive, isn't it my job to kind of figure out what are the qualities of the transgression then? And then to try to see where it leads me. My job is not to turn away from things as an artist. That just isn't what I'm paid to do. And so there was this kind of, bad boy sense of it, which I don't mind. I've never quite figured out if I'm a good person or a bad person, because that's not what art is about. Doing art is not about being good. Doing art is about doing art as powerfully as you can. How do you do that? And so here I had this idea that on the one hand was a kind of child's play, and on the other hand was going to be as serious and as true and as deep as where it led me. And I hate to use a word like this, but that I had the courage to go follow, you see. Sounds hokey, but there it is. That's art for you. Yes?
In your process, did you ever use real names?
No, men, of course, love men. It's a thing we don't like to talk about. I mean, I don't mean gay men. I don't mean being gay, but I mean just all men love men, right? Two. But I thought I would have my hands full just doing the female nude, and so and I'm not done with that subject yet, but it would be a great one, and maybe for someone else, but not for me yet. It may be more daring, but we just do what we can. My job is, just to operate within my abilities and my passions, right? If I had a stronger passion for the male form, then maybe I'd have gone after that in the same way. I can be corrected so easily on what I've done in this art, and so I stand corrected before you, just as Melville said. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, way back there.
When you surf, do you get into the zone?
Well, when I surf, do I get into the zone? Only when I'm lucky. I think. It's most of the time. It's a combination of effort and fear. But once in a while, things go better than that. Yes.
Oh, wait, I have a follow-up.
Yes.
When you have been there, is this sort of an out-of-body experience?
I don't know. One is very happy. It takes so much to put it together to make it work. Really, that's a fair question. I've written a lot about this in my water books. That state of happiness when, in such a powerful element, one makes it work. And I suppose it's a little bit like working well with another human being, or whether.
Yeah. So then
Yeah.
my follow-up to that is in John Donne's The Ecstasy,
Yes.
he talks about where that type of love, where the souls come together, it's not about sex, right? Where it's out of the body and it's not about sex.
Yes.
As you know, you started out with that preface, with that poem, which is not about sex, it's out of the body, the two souls come together.
I'm well aware of that.
Yeah. So
Where-
I'm wondering how, in your book, which is so filled with your descriptions of sex, where it's mostly about the sex, like in the moment of the sex.
Well, actually, thank you for your question. I think what you have to do is, if you read the book, you'll see it's a story, as I said, about art, about love, about passion, and about death. So I think it's, there many people do not like to be proved or corrected, but I do. So I thank you for your comment. Yes. Yes.
Just wondering who your favorite photographers are.
It's funny. I felt in looking at these works of art that I was moving along some curve of collective learning, right? And the photographers and the artists are learning from each other, of course, as they see each other's work. I would say that the Manuel Bravo photographs interested me a lot. Mostly, I would say that the photographs that appealed to me most are almost snapshots, often 19th century pictures of usually a beautiful young woman who's been dead for 100 years, right? And so that one is just totally blown away by the beauty of the young woman and the fact that she's been gone so long. And because my book is not just about passion at all, though of course I had great joy trying to describe passion, but there's no passion without loss. I mean, that's our condition. We're just moving through here, aren't we? So there's no one who experiences great passion is unaware of the risk of losing it sooner or later, and that's what my book is about. So certain photographs just are killing in the way they haunt you with what's already gone, right? Yes. Yes. Yeah. My taste in art, is pretty simple, and so probably, when we get to the Cubists, I'm beginning to lose interest. I can see what they're doing, I think, but I have less passion for those paintings. Once we get to Picasso, I begin to taper off. Though I am interested in contemporary painters who are trying to do the nude now. What's the name of that fellow in New York City? Pearlstein. Yeah, for instance. Thank you. Who said that? Raise your hand, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I think the nude is very hard to do, particularly now. And it still interests me, how people in any medium are approaching it. Are there other questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to sign books, and thank you again. Good night.